We're going to talk mostly tonight about the intersection of tech and politics. I'm here to moderate, not interview, but we do have some fun questions that Tech for Campaigns community contributed for the end. There's never been a time where tech and politics has been so inextricably linked. Just this week, Facebook and Twitter testified in front of Congress. Google skipped out. We're blocks away from several of the biggest tech companies in the world, so let's start there. This is a question I want you to both weigh in on, but we'll start with some choice words Kara has had about some of the tech companies. Kara, you've used the terms cesspools of humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a good one.
and digital arms dealers to refer to Facebook, Twitter, and several other companies.
That was a really good one.
Yeah. Do you think the cesspools can be cleaned up, or has the ship sailed?
That's a lot of metaphors all at once. No, I don't. I think it's incredibly difficult. One of the things that I've also written several times is that these systems were built the way they're being used. So let's just put that aside, because I think most people talk about how they were abused by the Russians, how the Russians came in and did this and this and this. The Russians are using them beautifully, just the way Donald Trump is using them beautifully. And the way they have been constructed and built is what we're getting for it. If you think about how things were built, you think about pillars. At Google, they thought about pillars of search. So a long time ago, it used to be breadth, speed, and relevance. And then it changed with Facebook and social media for engagement, speed,
popularity.
Exactly. And what does that bring to you if that's the case? Fake news, fake accounts, abuse of the platform, and not a platform that you would want. So they've built a cesspool, and therefore it is a cesspool. So it would naturally apply. So what they have to do is start shifting the way they're built to say accuracy, not speed necessarily, accuracy, context, and factual. So they have to think of ways to build it going forward, but I think they have to do a really enormous overhaul to fix what they've broken.
Howard?
I think I agree with Kara. I think that's exactly what the problem is. I suspect that this is going to be fixed from the outside, not the inside, not the government. And I suspect that for two reasons. One, there'll be a huge First Amendment debate, which is a very complicated issue, which we can discuss if you want to. But the other problem is the hallmark of this generation that uses Facebook and Google and so forth and so on, that's incredibly comfortable with it, that grew up with it, and are digital natives. One of their hallmarks is they force institutions to change. And I think what's happened in the last few months, or even since the election, when it became obvious that the Russians did in fact use Facebook, and Facebook was complicit with that, is that this generation, which is incredibly tech savvy and consumerist, may be the ones that put the pressure on even these giants of social interaction that this generation relies on. So Karen knows a lot more about this than I do, but the trend in this generation is to take matters into their own hands and fix it, and not rely on government to do that. And I suspect that is what ultimately will happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I think they'll find a way. Look at Twitter. I mean, Jack Dorsey. Look, Jack Dorsey didn't ban. What's that asshole's name? Alex Jones. He didn't ban
you can just
Alex.
Call him that asshole.
Right. he didn't ban Alex Jones because he assaulted Jack Dorsey and yelled at him. He was going to have to do it because the pressure on Twitter every single day by their users was enormous. And there's going to be a version of that with Facebook, and eventually there'll be a version of that with Google.
But you don't think that the government will step in and regulate?
Well, you have to have a government that actually knows what it's doing. That's always a first.
Oh, no, you don't.
Yeah.
That's never been
right. Fair point. If you saw the Zuckerberg hearings, I watched them all.
I watched them.
A loser. I watched them beginning to end. It was, someone at Facebook called me, how do you think Mark did? And I said, well, it was an extraordinarily low bar, so because they were so bad. If you watch
I think
hearings,
you said politicians are absolutely brain dead when it comes to tech.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's another. Yeah.
Polite.
But they don't have any sense of what's going on. You have really smart stuff happening in Europe, which is probably a little overboard. Many people think it's overboard. And then you've got stuff happening in California, for example, privacy laws that were just passed here. There's a whole bunch of net neutrality laws. So what you're going to see is activity from globally, from places like Europe, states, smarter states that are starting to crack down on it. I don't see the federal government making any inroads in this area. There's some smart people, like the hearings this week with Cheryl and Jack. I think Richard Burr and Mark Warner conducted a great hearing. I think it was smart. The questions were smart. It stayed on point. But what happens is it degenerates when you get into something like the House, and they think, you have someone literally talking about terms of service as if it was the greatest threat to democracy going, like that they can't read a terms of service agreement. And so that's the real problem, is that that there's not the expertise within government, and especially in this administration, which doesn't have any science. They don't have a science advisor. They don't have a CTO. They don't have a lot of things, but they really don't have anyone in those areas that are doing anything of any substance.
I agree with that, but I also believe this. Look, this election is not about left and right coming up. The news media is incredibly lazy when they write about that stuff. It's about young versus old, and our party is being overtaken by young people, which I think is the best thing that could possibly happen, and it's just happening. And people of color, which, I mean, this is our base. Finally, our actual people who are getting elected are starting to look like the base of the Democratic Party, which before it was I got elected and we expected them to vote for me. Well, that's not going to happen anymore. So I think that everything is going to change when this generation takes power. I'm not sure that it isn't going to be government that fixes it eventually. It certainly won't be the imbeciles on the House or even most of the senators, partly because of the senility factor and people like Orrin Hatch and those. I mean, really and truly, it's just extraordinary to have a chairman of the Judiciary Committee who's senile.
Do? Did you like that question?
Yeah. What is Facebook? So I'm not sure. I think when this generation takes power, they are, I think, emotionally opposed to government regulation. I actually think they're libertarian. I think the left wing of the Democratic Party is going to be very disappointed because this is a group that actually is going to shrink government and outsource a lot of the government functions to Planned Parenthood and variety of things because they don't like big institutions. But I do think that this generation is going to be much more likely to come up with tech solutions that work without infringing the things that they really like about tech. I totally agree that the feds can't do it now. I also believe that the Europeans, tough as they are, have much better regulation about almost anything, whether it's the environment or labor or consumer protection, and
savvy and tech savvy. There is one
well.
thing that they talked about in the hearings this week, this Communications Decency Act, which passed I wrote about it in the Washington Post, I think. I'm sorry, 96. Yeah, it was a long time ago. There's a Section 230. Which I think to me, they mentioned it and everyone was not paying attention to it, but it's immunity essentially that these companies have for what's on their platform. And media companies other companies don't have this immunity, this broad immunity that allowed the internet to grow. I think there's been some chipping away at Section 230, such as around sex trafficking and other things. There was just a recent case. And so if that starts to happen, these companies don't look so good as businesses because they have to pay for the trouble they make, the mess they make. So that kind of stuff, if that happens, that would be a really interesting wrinkle and a really problematic problem for Silicon Valley for sure.
But I mean, just to go back to sort of the politicians are brain dead about tech.
Yeah. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, does that just fix itself because younger people get elected? Or because at what point does that become like inexcusable?
Well, government
I think younger people get elected.
Yeah.
That's what's happening right now.
But it's not in government. They've been trying to put, like, if you think about government, I went on that show Meet the Press, which was, speaking of, and there were literally speaking of brain dead, there were 5 elderly white men across from me, and I opened it up. I opened it up and I said, the diversity here is amazing. You all have different colored ties on the air. And they were like, you don't say that. But I got into a debate with David Brooks. Do you know him? Yeah. And he's my colleague now, so he's great. And he said, he's like, well, Kara, bloggers in their pajamas. And for some reason, I couldn't shut up. And I said, are you 105 years old? Like, bloggers are not in pajamas. I have no pajamas. And then they were talking about, we were talking, I think, about what happened with Obama and the healthcare initiative, the website that didn't work. And I said, every day people get hooked up so they can have sex on Tinder, and it really works. Like they
Said this on Meet the Press?
Yes. They said this
Damn, I stopped watching that. That was a mistake.
Yeah, they were poor. I wasn't invited back. So my point, and they were like, "You're comparing, this to I said it works. These massive systems, whether it's Google or Facebook, they all work. And I said, and Tinder really works. People get what they want from this app, and everything matches. And healthcare is a matching thing anyway, so they should be able to do it. And it must have been Brooks. He's like, "Are you comparing this to Tinder?" I go, "No, Tinder works. You can get fucked." And I didn't say fucked, but it was like there's not a mentality within government to think about tech first. They have tech people in the room, but they treat them like they're fixing the email. Go fix the email or something like that. They're not integrated into the process. And I think the states, again, there's a lot more really interesting stuff going on the state level, for sure.
Although the states don't yet know what they're doing. California may be an exception, maybe Massachusetts. I mean, tech centers where you have a core group of industries in the business, maybe. We screwed up in Vermont, which is a pretty easy place to govern, only 600,000 people. We actually respect each other across the aisle and all that stuff. But we hired the same consultant that Obama hired and screwed up our exchange for 2 years. I do think this is not going to get better until people my age aren't deciding what tech to do. I mean, you got to have the people who actually understand tech doing this stuff. And the biggest problem is not so much that old people don't understand it and they're the decision makers. The biggest problem is they don't understand each other. When you sit down, explain to me, who's sympathetic and knows how important this stuff is, if you explain to me how stuff works, I'm lost after about 8 sentences. And the dirty secret about my campaign was, it is true that we were the first campaign to get this generation involved in politics. It is true that we were the pioneers of internet fundraising. It is also true that the reason it happened is we have no money, we didn't pay any attention, and we let the 23-year-olds do whatever the hell they wanted, and they invented all this stuff. We didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Twitter, we hardly had webcams. And every day, some kid who's 23 years old would come up. One time, some guy came up to me and said, when you're out on the road 2 weeks, you go back to the headquarters. When you get home, you can thank everybody because they're all killing themselves for you. So I went in, I'm sitting down, and some kid comes up and says, "Governor, we want you to sit in front of this computer and have a ham sandwich." And I said, "What?" And said, "Yeah, we have." And they rigged up this webcam, which is in its infancy, and said, "Dick Cheney's giving a fundraiser for $25,000 a couple in Charleston, South Carolina. We want you to have a ham sandwich, and we'll live stream it and see." And we raised $625,000, and he raised $525,000. We didn't think of any of this, so how are we supposed to? But they figured it all out. Now these 23-year-olds are 20, 37, and so forth. So I really do think it's going to have to be this process where look, the DNC is really struggling with tech. We have a terrific tech guy. The problem is nobody understands what the hell he's talking about. And then when we get into the politics of it, it's really tough.
It was embarrassing this last election cycle. It was
embarrassing.
Terrible. Republicans have actually, even though your campaign got a lot
they
of
leapfrogged
credit,
us.
They were there from the beginning. One of my most unpleasant interviews I ever had was Ralph Reed, but I did an interview. I know, right? I literally wanted to like sucker punch him backstage. But this is a guy who runs We Hate Gay People, whatever. I don't know what the organization is.
And everybody else.
And everybody else. So, but the reason I had him on stage is because he was so savvy when he was running a lot of
That's true.
He literally was the most savvy person I'd ever met during that period. And it was 15, 20 years ago, around political fundraising. If you think about it, Republicans, and especially the alt-right and the Tea Party, they have been out in the wilderness forever. I mean, the media is run by more liberal companies. They were out in the wilderness, except for Fox News, when that debuted. They did not have ways to do it. And so they're naturally better at it because they had to sort of be part of that. And you can see it in every one of their groups. So look at the money they're spending. They're just better at it.
But Howard really led the way in 2004. He just told that story. Obama was known for his tech operation. And yet the Dems spend a third of what Republicans spend on tech. Like, why are the Dems so far behind on this, Howard?
Obama ran the best 2 campaigns in the history of the presidency. Republicans generally run much better campaigns than we do because they're much more disciplined, and they have a much darker view of humanity, and campaigns are dark. Look, this is what I teach kids. Politics is a substitute for war. The same impulses is about resource allocation and succession. And the very worst instincts in people come out in politics. And luckily, we just had the French Revolution in this country, and nobody went to the guillotine yet. So, yeah, Trump has his ideas about how to do that, if he has any. So, I think part of the problem is that the Republicans are incredibly disciplined. We actually had a big edge, especially when I got to the DNC. Blue State came out of my campaign. It was all young kids that came out of my campaign. They started Blue State. Then I hired Blue State to redo all the tech in the DNC, which was essentially non-existent. Obama hired them away from me in 2006. But what Obama had that we didn't was discipline. He had a guy who was probably in his late 40s, David Plouffe, who, whatever his personal attributes might be, probably knew where every single Democratic voter was in the country and got them all out. So he applied a rubric, a framework, a metric to all these unbelievably creative kids who were building this stuff. And that's why I think Obama's tech was so great. What happened to the DNC is when you have the presidency, basically it becomes a re-elect for the president. Obama built his own with OFA. It was a total disaster. Then he got a totally incompetent chair, and the whole thing just collapsed. And there was nothing left, essentially, and we have to rebuild it, but we can't because there's no centralization in politics anymore. This generation doesn't believe in centralization. They find it incredibly unattractive. They're not even Democrats, but they do agree with our principles. So they're all running as Democrats. Some of them call themselves democratic socialists. It's actually it's a fascinating, I think what's going on here is our party is being taken over, which I think is the best thing possible. I'm deeply hoping for a presidential nominee who's under 50, maybe 55. Because I think we've desperately got to have new leadership. And 55-year-olds aren't tech geniuses either for the most part, but they're smart enough and know enough about tech so they're going to hire really smart kids who are going to figure out how to do this. And by the way, where the hell did Ajit Pai come from? Speaking of...
He's not stupid.
He's not stupid, but Jesus, what the hell's the matter with his ideology?
I'll ask him.
If either of you were the head of the DNC right now, what would you do?
It has to be all digital. It has to be, the outreach has to be almost all digital.
But what would, basically what's happened is groups like us and Run for Something and Indivisible, we've all picked off sections of the pie that really the DNC should be doing, and we do it better. Mm-hmm. So we do tech and digital. Indivisible does the ground stuff. Run for Something helps pick candidates.
Which is how you're going to see it happen. I mean,
so if you were the DNC right now, would you start working with them? Would you bring them in? What would you do?
Well, that's what I'm doing. I'm working with Hillary and with Judith McHale and with Amy Rao, and we're raising money for all these groups because they do, with the exception of tech, which is why I'm here, they circumscribe all the functions of the Democratic Party. And it's never going to be centralized. They're going to do their own thing. The only thing we ask in return for a lot of money basically is work together, which actually horrified them. I once said to Amanda Littman, eventually I'm going to ask you to, because I'm raising a lot of money for her. And I said, eventually we're going to ask you to work together. She said, I don't want to do that. I don't want indivisible directors telling me what to do. And I said, well, it's not going to be like that. We just want you to talk to each other. And gradually they now are. But we have just about every base covered except for tech, because the political problems, internal political problems in the DNC are so bad around tech and control, and because of 8 years of mismanagement, a lot of the states have already done their own tech operations. Of course, they're not any good at it for the most part either, so they've screwed it all up and semi-privatized it, which I think is an enormous mistake.
And it's also a governing thing. For example, I just did a really good podcast with Ron Wyden talking about election machine tampering. That's just another whole area that there hasn't been a bill that really is going to address that. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that it can be screwed with, and then there's just your basic block and tackle using of digital platforms and the way you use them best. Now, look, who would have thought that Donald Trump was literally the best Twitter troll ever? Like, ever. He's really good. And whenever I say he's really good at it, everyone's like, oh, he's terrible. I'm like, no, he's really good. Like, him and Kim Kardashian compete to be who's better at Twitter. But they have a natural sense of what works. And I think one of the things the Democratic Party could do is start to at least understand what worked in 2016, where the Republicans really cleaned the clock once again with the Democrats on Facebook, the uses of Facebook, how to reach people, doing ads. Aside from the Russians, aside from everything else, they did an astonishing job of using those platforms.
Okay, but let me make a point about this, though, because this is really important. It's true what you said about Trump, but he only caters to the dark side. They are so successful in doing what the dark side does. They appeal to the worst instincts of all of it. Look, we all have bad instincts as well as good instincts. We like to think, I think our bias is towards our positive instincts. Their bias is towards their negative view of humanity. And ours is a positive view of humanity. So it is easier to appeal, especially when people are frightened about demography and frightened about the fact that they don't have a high school education and they can't get work and support their families anymore and their kids are all moving to the cities. It is really easy, and it's been done for centuries, to point the finger at a variety of groups and crank up your people by appealing to the very worst in them. That is easy.
But these platforms are built to appeal to the worst. They're not
I
built
agree
to
with that.
I mean, that's the problem. The reason they work is because, say, Elon Musk can go on. And by the way, you really should have had marijuana here tonight. But that's at all events now. It's a requirement at all events.
His stock price just went down about 8 more percent, though.
Like
Everyone in the crowd's microdosing. Don't worry.
Okay. So, I mean, the problem is these platforms are built for that, for engagement, for titillation, for keeping you on an addiction high. And, you know, it does relate to the addiction issue, too, because it's very close when you think of these tech companies of how addictive these platforms can be and how they also sort of change your... I'm working on a column right now about Instagram and about the performative nature of it and how it really does... I don't know about you, but I feel bad looking at Instagram because I'm like, I didn't have that Maine lobster there and with my perfect children and stuff like that. So I was going to try an experiment, which I'm doing, to put really awful photos on Instagram. Like, here's a urine-soaked area mattress of San Francisco, of which there are 20 million. Or here's my kids, like, sneaking in after curfew or something like that, to see if you could create an Instagram that is actual reality. But I think a lot of these things with addiction, the addiction combined with the way they're built combined, it's a perfect storm for someone like Donald Trump. And it actually works, even if it's based in fear. Based in happiness doesn't work on these platforms.
Well, that's the question. Can we figure out how to appeal to people's best instincts instead of their worst instincts using tech? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but if we don't do it, we're really in for a huge problem as a species.
Well, I guess one of the things that you mentioned, Howard, is that you think it's young versus old. But Bernie Sanders is not young. So how do you explain that?
Well, because Bernie Sanders...
And we were just talking about Elizabeth Warren. I wouldn't call her young.
No, I agree with that. They're more or less the same age, somewhat, pretty much. I mean, when you get to be that old, which I mean, I'm older than Elizabeth Warren, so I mean, you know, not as old as Bernie, though. So I tell you what...
No one's as old as Bernie.
Right. So here's my view of this. And actually, there's some similarity between me and Bernie in this way. Bernie tells it like it is, and I tell it like it is. And I think one of the reasons I was popular is because I was just willing to say things that other people weren't willing to say. Bernie's problem is formulating solutions. But in this campaign where you had a very establishment person, who I worked very hard for because I think Hillary's wonderful, but that's not the image that she projects, Bernie was the perfect foil. He's not going to be the perfect foil the next time, but he was the perfect foil this time. Bernie, interesting, fascinating. He came out with this platform 2 days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, which took Bezos to task at about the way Bezos treats his workers, which I think is fair game. He got eaten alive by the progressive economic think tanks in Washington saying, this is all fine and good, but this is the wrong solution. You should stop talking like somebody from the 1950s and start thinking about how you're really going to fix this. It doesn't work to tax Bezos 100% until you pay back. In fact, you're actually attacking the notion that being on Medicaid is a bad thing, and maybe we should have Medicaid, which in fact is how Obama actually covered more people through his Medicaid expansion than anything else. I was shocked, because I bet a lot of those folks voted for Bernie. But you know, Bernie is fantastic at setting out what the problem is, and nobody was talking about the real problems. The next time, lots of people are going to be talking about the real problems, and I think he's going to have a tough race in his hands.
Do you think
runs.
So do you think it was not smart to go after Bezos?
I think the problem was not going after Bezos. Bezos is not a terribly popular person. The problem was the solution. People are getting hip to the solutions. They don't want to just hear what the problems are. He did a great job of that. Now they want to know what the solutions are, and they want solutions that work. And you can't use 1950s socialism to answer these problems, because this generation knows that doesn't work either.
And also, I would actually take exception. I don't think people hate Bezos. Hello. I don't think people hate. I think people love Amazon. They love their uses of Amazon.
They do love Amazon.
So it's really interesting when you think about
it. Everybody loves Amazon.
You know,
There's no
one of the
question
things
about
that you talked about, though, is when you're thinking about running on these things, the real issues will be coming in the next 20 years around jobs and
Right.
the future of work. And I think that's a really winning discussion of how are we going to manage the future of work given everything that can be digitized as a job will be digitized, all of them. And so there's going to be this displacement, and not just, they always do the truck driver's not going to truck drive. Of course there's not going to be any truck driver jobs. There's not going to be radiologist jobs. There's not going to, you could go through them like that. Lawyers, all kinds of jobs are going to be affected. But the person who starts to talk about that to people, about where, because people do have a really good sense that this is coming. They could see it with tech. They could see what the impact of tech is going to have on them. And the problem we have, and I've said this before, is we have at the very top of society a group of people that leans forward into the future, loves tech. The group at the really high, the top, has made an obscene amount of money doing it. Like obscene. Like it's astonishing that someone has $64 billion. There's something. I mean, I'm all for capitalism, but oh my God, that's ridiculous. And then you have those people at the top, and then at the very bottom, you have a group of people that will never catch up. That they are mired in opiate addiction. The education system has let them down terribly, and they're not going to get into the tech thing. And then you have a whole group of people in the middle that understand that tech is going to impact their jobs. They understand that change is coming, and that's who the appeal is like to really, that's why some of these tech people may be appealing as candidates in some ways.
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. People actually don't want politicians to change things as much as they think they do. They really don't. And it's why politicians don't actually lead, they follow. So I think the people who talk about this issue are going to get their ass kicked. What you want to talk about is some place where somebody's comfortable. Yeah, we can agree we should stop immigration, because blah, 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 blah. I'm not to say that you're not right. I think your analysis of what's going to happen in the job market is starting. We need to start talking about UBI and stuff like that. Which suggests
more populism than ever.
That's right. But there have to be people who think about this and do something about it, but the candidates are going to be the last people to do it, because in a democracy, you play safe. I mean, one of the problems we face in this democracy is because in order to have transparency, we demand quarterly earnings. Well, quarterly earnings is great, except there's no reward for long-term thinking. You can do it if you're Bezos, because he basically runs the company and owns most of it, or a lot of it. But you can't do it for most. I mean, Jack Welch massaged earnings for years, and he's revered in the business community. He was a crook. And the next guy, who I really like a lot and know well, it was an incompetent. And this is the greatest company in the world. It was just destroyed. In Congress, you have 2-year terms. Well, there is no premium whatsoever on taking risk or doing thinking in politics. All that is in the private sector. And I actually think that's why the country is successful, because you have a very creative, risk-reward oriented groups of people who are willing to take chances in the private sector. That's where the drive for the change comes. So they are going to talk about this issue, but they're going to be the last people to talk about it. And this issue is actually going to be solved at local and state levels before it gets fixed at the federal level.
So you have politicians, and all you get is nothing. You get nothing with the politician or anything. But if you actually leave it to the states, when I did this podcast recently with Mark Zuckerberg, a lot of the attention fell to his idiotic statement about Holocaust deniers, which I was like, he was saying it, I was like, oh, keep talking, it's fine. But that really wasn't the point. The thing that he said that was completely stupid. But the thing that he said that I thought was more important is I said, are you a nation state? Because I think of you as a nation state. And he said, no, we're a company. But you have to start thinking of these companies as nation states. They have this vast amount of influence. They're ill-prepared they literally want to push away power and are not, like, one of the columns I wrote for the Times was like, I think the problem with Facebook is Mark Zuckerberg quit college and didn't take that ethics and humanities course he probably should have taken. He's not thought about it once. And so, thank you, Professor. And it sounds dumb, but a lot of these people are ill-prepared to take on the power they have and haven't even thought about the impact. And that's the problem, is you've got people who were not elected messing with the democracy, and mostly because they don't, it's really, if you start to think about their power, and they feel very, as you know from Silicon Valley people, they feel very aggrieved when you insult them in any way. But years ago, I was when Larry, I think it was Larry, I can't tell them apart, Larry or Sergey. I was calling them, I can, but I don't like to. So I called them because they were going to try to buy Yahoo or do Yahoo search, and so they would have had 99% of the search in the market. And so I wrote a column that said, I was comparing it to Microsoft when they had the monopoly trial, and I said, at least Microsoft knew they were thugs. Which they didn't like, which I thought was a great line. And one of them called me and said, how can you call us that? We're really good people, like that line, like we're really good people. Like, I'm like, yeah, but you're gonna have 99% of the market. Who knows what you're gonna do with it? And they kept saying, we're really good people, we're gonna do the right thing, we're gonna do this. And I said, can I ask you a question, because I think you never think beyond tomorrow, is who runs Google in 20 years? What if it's a really evil person? Wow, that's a disturbing thing.
Right.
And they're like, oh, that's something to think about. I'm like, yeah, it's something to think about, you idiot. Like, it was, so I think that they don't, like, each of these companies, Jack Dorsey, whether it's Jack Dorsey, who's stumbling around trying to figure out what the First Amendment is, and Mark, who's not thinking about it, it's just like, that's who's making the rules that is impacting everybody.
So there's a phenomenon that goes on. Politicians generally aren't very good at this, except for the occasional introspective one, which there are not many of. And I think it's more prevalent in business, which is this lack of understanding of responsibility. And it's also this happens in politics all the time. I was saved in politics for the most part by having a wife who didn't give a damn that I was in politics, and having a chief of staff who wasn't the least bit afraid of me. Because otherwise you start to believe your own horse shit. No, look, nobody is good all the time, or is a quote-unquote good person all the time. And you start making compromises. Unless somebody calls you on your compromises, you keep making them. And sooner or later, you're doing really crappy things. I think business people are particularly ill-equipped to do this because their mission was to start a great business. And they did, and now they don't know what to do with the responsibility of being a nation state. I mean, there are actually, corporations can be really great influences. When I was young, many years ago in the civil rights movement, IBM was hiring African-American directors and senior people and doing environmental things long before they had to. And there were other companies that were also doing things like that long before they had to. There were a whole bunch of other ones that were avoiding it at all costs. I think one of the problems in business is people don't understand what the social responsibility is that they have.
Tech companies don't.
Yeah, and that's because that's not what they started out doing. Now, I think one of the things that happens is, especially in places like Google, which is, I agree, far from perfect, but when you have a huge cadre of young people who feel strongly about social responsibility, that percolates up more than something that percolates down. It is true that there are great leaders who believe in social responsibility at the top. I think Warren Buffett could be called one of those, or there are plenty of things that he has participated in that you might not agree with.
Are there any running a company right now that aren't Warren Buffett?
That are interested in
that
social...
are there any companies you think are doing a good job?
Heck, if I had to pick one, I guess it would be Tim Cook. You know what I mean? Like, he's an adult. At least he speaks like an adult. And what was really interesting is we did an MSNBC special with him in Chicago around education. And I asked him, what would you do if you were Mark Zuckerberg? And he said, I wouldn't have gotten in this mess in the first place.
Right.
Which everyone at Facebook was like, he insulted us. It was crazy. But then he went on to have a very cogent explanation of the problem, the business model, the way it was based. But it's really hard to find, they have this, if you think of just the motto of Facebook was move fast and break things. Who thought of that? Like, whoa, wait a minute, really break things? Like, really, is that? And I know what they were doing. They were talking about break the rules, I get what they were doing. They have a very convoluted explanation of it. But the fact of the matter is it says everything. Right? And so now what I've always said is, like, move fast and break things. Well, you better fix the things you broke. Like, but that's the mentality of not having the responsibility. And the abrogation of responsibility has been, and especially the groupthink in these companies. I don't know how many of you work at these
groupthink exists everywhere. It's not just these companies.
And they really like it. At one point, someone at Facebook, I remember, they're like, we've been together 10 years, Kara. This is great. I'm like, this is bad. Like, you're all like each other. You're all at each other's barbecues. You're taking each other's jets and borrowing them back and forth. And so there's been no irritant in the system that says this, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? You know what I mean? Because the cohesion is so strong among them as a group of people.
So I think that's true. Let me just raise
that's the good and the bad.
Let me raise an issue about
Not
a
really
non-tech company that I find fascinating. Now, I'm suspicious of big corporations because I think there's a wage discrepancy, and the gap between the workers and the CEO is too big and all that. What about Nike hiring Colin Kaepernick? For which they've gotten there. No, seriously, I mean, look, I don't know if Nike is a wonderful company or not.
No.
It may not be a wonderful company.
No, they had some issues.
Okay, maybe they did. All I know is
Particularly with women.
that the effect of what they did was to make a point that where the president was kicking people's asses on completely false pretenses and deliberately distorting stuff, and Nike says, fuck you. Now, they may have had all kinds of other reasons to do that. I don't know what they were. And Phil Knight is a Republican, so you suspect.
I think they're trying to sell more shoes, but
except a lot of them have gotten burned.
No, whatever. That was like 3 people and wherever. It's so stupid.
Did you see the guy whose house got burned down his own house
because
he was setting? I'm serious. Some
guy
guy burned down his house yesterday by mistake.
You burned those shoes. You keep
all right, but we digress.
Here's who I like a lot is a woman named Rose Marcario. I'd urge you to listen to a podcast I did with her. She's the CEO of Patagonia. Actually, a very amazing company that lives its values and really does. They've sued the government around some national parks, and they've created a bond with their customers in a way that I think is. They're very true to their corporate values and stick to them. And the stuff she does, and she used to be in Silicon Valley. She was a tech banker, I think, or something like, or a lawyer. And so she's very well aware, and she's the first person who ever really called out tech companies for their lack of clear and cogent responsibility around things. And I think they're going to have to because their employees, if you think about bases, tech companies' bases are their employees. And so if the employees start to demand this stuff, you imagine they will, like with Google and Maven and Microsoft on some of the Defense Department stuff.
I'm going to do one more question, then we'll do some fun stuff, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So we've talked a lot about tech and a little bit about the Democratic Party, but now we're talking about messaging with Nike. What should the top 2 messages of the Democratic Party be?
Okay, this is one of the greatest, most misunderstood things that everybody writes about and everybody talks about, and nobody understands what the hell they're talking about. Bill Clinton, I think, is the smartest political mind that in my lifetime. The last president who had his political capabilities was Franklin Roosevelt. And one of the things Clinton talked about was the meta message. In off-year elections, there's only one meta message. We're not the president. Obama lost 63 seats in 2010. 63 seats. We're not Obama. Our message is actually carried by the messenger of Donald Trump. We're not Trump. That's the message. All this bullshit that Democrats have to have, we have lots of messages. We have 435 messages in districts. Conor Lamb is a great addition to the Democratic Party, and so is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And they are really far apart ideologically. That is not the point. The point is you talk to your own district and you control the message. There cannot be a big message that's going to be just as good in San Francisco as it is in Houston. It's just not going to happen. But and it shouldn't happen. It can't happen because you're there, you're hiring people to represent you. If you're living in Texas, you're not going to feel the way about issues for the most part as you will in San Francisco.
Well, there are overall messages, right? What was Hillary's again? What was it? No, that was a good one, but what? Yes, that felt like a glue commercial to me.
See, I don't think those things mean anything. It is possible.
No, come on, Morning America was so.
Good Morning in America, that was a good message.
Morning in America, I almost voted for Reagan. I was like, I hate him. You know what I mean? But it was but it was close because of that thing.
No, that's true. That was a great message. It's morning again in America. But the subtext was, I'm not Jimmy Carter. But you don't do that. We don't have to run on we're not Donald Trump. But Trump, that's one of the good things about Trump is he reminds everybody what an asshole he is every day with this ridiculous stuff that goes on. But we do have to have some positive message. And in 2020, if you don't have a positive message when you're running for president, you're going to lose, period.
So in 2020, what should it be? If this were 2020 today, what should the message be? I
actually think that a great messenger is Barack Obama, and he laid out a lot of the stuff today. We're better than this. It's probably not going to be about the economy, although by that time maybe there'll be a recession. I don't know because I'm a little nervous about the frothiness in the market. But I think it'll be, it might be, it's morning in America. We can believe in ourselves again.
Maybe it's like mid-afternoon in America.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't know what it's going to be. The honest truth is, the most important part of the message is the person who runs. You cannot craft a Madison Avenue message unless you know who's running because it has to fit the person who runs. So who we pick is going to matter a lot. That's why I want somebody who's young, because I think that in itself is a message, especially if we're running against Donald Trump or Mike Pence.
Okay, let's do a little word association. I'm going to say a name. Tell me what the first word that comes to mind.
All right.
Jeff Flake.
Wimp.
Spineless.
Yeah.
Mark
Handsome.
Zuckerberg.
Earnest.
Clueless.
Okay.
Pete Buttigieg.
I don't know. Who's that?
He's the mayor of South Bend, and Howard wanted him to be the leader of the
I
DNC.
did.
You go ahead. I don't know.
This is perfect. I tried really hard to get. I couldn't get a vote for this
You
guy.
got one word there, Howard. Come on.
No, I'm just going to tell the story. This guy.
And
You're ruining the game, Howard.
No.
you
These guys don't know who Pete
One
Buttigieg
word,
is.
one word.
Pete Buttigieg is 36 years old. He's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And he served two tours of duty in Afghanistan, and he's openly gay. Tell me a better spokesperson for the younger generation than that. So I thought he should
Tom
be the
Perez. Just kidding.
Anyway, up and coming. That's my word.
Okay. Bernie Sanders.
1950s.
Meh.
Cory
I've
Booker.
got a blockage in my intestine. That's
Cory Booker.
you know what I mean? Cory Booker. Slick. Slick.
Stock went up yesterday.
And what's your word for him? I think he's slick.
Not ready for prime time.
The anonymous author of the piece in the New York Times this week.
It's me. I wrote it.
That's bad because
No.
my is this really bad writer.
Yeah.
That's awful English.
I veer between brave and stupid. I don't know. You know what I mean? I think it was not well thought out by the writer. I'm glad the Times did it, but it's still.
Okay.
Yeah. What did you think?
I thought it was awful writing. I thought that I'm puzzled by it because the Times must have vetted him. It's a precedent breaking, and the Times is 190 years old and doesn't like to do precedent breaking stuff. So I don't know what the hell to make of it. And there was this, I don't actually think this is true, but there was a plot that was tempting, which was this was actually written with Trump's knowledge to allow him to carry on about how terrible, this is all written. I'm glad they did it, and I thought it was ridiculous, and I haven't given it much thought. I'm just glad it drives Trump crazy, but I thought the whole thing was reasonably worthless.
Okay.
And I thought, actually, Obama said the best thing about this today,
what did he say?
which is, I don't think we ought to be giving medals to people who disagree with 10% of the stuff while they're empowering the other 90% of the crazy stuff that the White House is doing. That's almost the exact quote.
Yeah.
And I think that's about right. We're making too much out of this. It's like a Trump tweet.
Yeah, it is.
And meanwhile, we're confirming a perjurer to the United States Supreme Court.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Okay, I'm going to do, there's 6 questions. You can plead the 5th on only one of them.
All right.
And then we'll do a couple audience questions before we wrap. Would Pence be better?
Oh, good God. That's like, should I get...
Just some quick.
That's like, should I have gonorrhea or venereal disease? No. I can't believe I just said that, but no.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, you're not gay, so...
Incredibly painful. No, I mean, he'd be
Gays are
terrible
like-
on all the things we care about, but he probably wouldn't push the nuclear button without thinking about it.
Should Trump's Twitter account be shut down?
No.
Absolutely not. That's our best weapon to mobilize our base.
One tech executive that you want to run for office, who would it be?
Garrett, no, not an executive. That's a good question. Can you go first?
Nobody, because they're all going to get their ass kicked. The idea of us nominating a billionaire, no matter how wonderful there are, is
Trying to
about
think
the
of somebody
chance of
who's
that is
thoughtful.
0.015%. There isn't anybody who can do that. That means
hard.
it's not going to happen.
Maybe Brian Chesky from Airbnb. He's a very thoughtful, interesting. If I had to pick someone.
Should Nancy Pelosi be the Speaker of the House if the Dems win back the House?
She will be. She'll be Speaker
No, that's not what we asked.
Should she be?
Should she?
Yes,
She should be.
for one more term. And then she should pick a transitional figure to move it on to the next generation.
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
the
what
only
do
way
you say?
she's going to win,
Yeah.
is to make it clear that she's going to be the transition. She's really incredibly talented, unbelievably talented. People who think Nancy Pelosi doesn't know what she's doing are fools. But she's 78 years old, and we want a Congress whose average age is 42 if we can help it. And that means we need different
One term.
leadership. So I think one
They
term
shouldn't
and-
be fighting
and
with each
then
other out the
transition.
gate
Right.
when they've won, if they win.
Top 2 picks for Democratic nominee in 2020. Only 2.
Go first.
Chris Murphy and Eric Garcetti.
Jogging Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Okay. Final question. Yes or no, will you be running for office in the future?
No!
Maybe. Maybe.
That's what primary is about, and it happened in Virginia. They may feel like that, but they're behind the times. In Virginia, when we won 15 seats, 11 women, about 5 people of color, 2 African Americans, the first Latina ever elected, a Muslim, a transgendered woman, and a gay woman. Now, really,
We supported
I mean,
many of them.
that is what our party looks like. That is the base of our party, and it's already happening. So what you should say is, then why don't you do something about it? Because a lot of your people your age are doing something about it, including you, who's 29 years old and running for supervisor or whatever you're running for. What are you running for? Yeah, okay. So, I mean, that's how it happens.
Yeah.
And the base is being mobilized, and it's happening now. Look, I'm not theoretically talking about a youth takeover of the party. This is well underway. The DNC just got rid of all the superdelegate votes on the first ballot, which I, as a superdelegate, supported. Why? Because generational transitions happen, and we can do it the easy way or the hard way. And the easy way is to make the place more flexible. It's happening now. I understand the feeling, and I understand people feel like that. It's not true, and they have to get off their ass and go out and vote. Otherwise, it'll continue to be true in their mind. But it's not true in a lot of other places that are less progressive than, look at Stacey Abrams,
Yeah,
for God's
she's
sakes.
amazing.
And she's at 45 in that election
She's an
right now.
astonishing
Yeah.
politician. She really is.
But this is Georgia, for God's sakes. I mean, this is happening now. And
She's
so
an interesting. She's an interesting appeal because
Yeah.
she does compromise with the other side. She's highly intelligent. She's not a technocrat, but she's reasonable. That's her
She's a
message.
pragmatist.
She's a pragmatist in a way that's really appealing and kind of wonky too. And she's a really interesting.
But here's the theoretical basis of Stacey Abrams' campaign, which is the difference. In the South, we used to try to get our base out, which is mostly African Americans, and then be conservative enough to get enough white folks to vote for us, in addition to the 10% of liberals that are white liberals are in the South. Stacey Abrams' view is, no, you mobilize the hell out of your base and people will be drawn to you out of conviction politics. We're going to see if it works. This is pretty extraordinary.
exactly
A black woman nominated for governor of Georgia who is now tied in the polls. So, I mean, it's happening now, and I get that you go door to door and people are disheartened and all that stuff. You can't tell this to voters because they're actually your boss, but their message is get off your ass and go out and vote, and guess what? You're going to elect a 29-year-old as supervisor, and then you won't feel like this anymore.
No, there's two things going on. Like, for example, in the last election, Silicon Valley did not support Hillary Clinton. Absolutely not. There was not as heavy of an interest. There wasn't as heavy of a donation. It was kind of interesting to watch as close, because they were having trouble raising money here, which was interesting in a lot of ways. And Obama had huge support, as you know. I think the fact of the matter is the way people are going to raise money is going to be so varied the way the internet's varied. You know, you're not going to have the old ways of doing things. And so candidates have to get incredibly entrepreneurial of how they raise money and how they attract attention and how they use media. Never in our lives we had such just the way things are going in media. Like, you never have thought there'd be this much television. You'd never thought there'd be this many voices. You never thought you've got to really start to rethink how politics are done almost completely, or how you attract people. I think like Stacey's a really good example. She's now supported and everything else, but initially she was just plugging away. They thought that other woman was going to win.
Stacey Evans,
Stacey
yeah.
Evans, yeah. So
Who got a third of the vote. It was exciting. I mean, she really got the hell beat out of her.
yeah,
It was
she did.
amazing.
And nobody thought that.
I actually have some disagreement with the premise, because I think that it wasn't that Gillum won because he got big checks from Tom Steyer and Soros. It's what he did with the money. Gillum engaged in digital advertising, and nobody else did. Mm-hmm. And more so than anybody else. I mean, we're way behind the 8 ball. See, I actually fundamentally don't think you can change the institution of the Democratic Party. I think you should ignore it. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I think Tom Perez is a good guy. Look, there's one function of the DNC that's left, and that is run a good convention and run the good nominating process. The rest of it's all being done by all these groups that we're here talking about. And that's the future. This generation doesn't think in big centralized organizational terms. It's going to be this way. It's not that I thought of all this. These groups existed, and I looked at the groups and I thought, wait a minute, this is designed by this generation. This is how they're going to do it. We need to get on board and to teach them the things that they don't know about politics, because they can't know because they haven't lived long enough to see all of it. But this is the model. When we reconstitute I agree that what you said about the Democratic Party, people think the Democratic Party is a waste. The Democratic Party, whether it's still going to be called the Democratic Party, it probably will be. It's going to be completely going to function in a different way. Not because the Democratic Party, as it exists in Washington, is willing to give up the power. They're just going to be ignored until this generation takes over. And then when my grandchildren get older, they're going to take over too. It's natural, and it's going to happen. And it's not going to look anything like, the Democratic establishment is not going to look anything like it does today 10 years from now. And it's going to become proportionally less and less important as people figure out how to do this for themselves. Run for Something has recruited 15,000 people, mostly women, who are running for office, and a hell of a lot of them are winning. In the last primary set of primaries, more than half of the candidates of Emerge, which is another candidate group that recruits women and trains them and so forth, won. 39% of the people that they recruited are women of color. I mean, that's what has to happen. It was never going to happen top down from the Democratic Party, much as we talked about it, much as the Democratic Convention looks like America, because we had enough people in the establishment of color and so LGBT and so forth. But now it's going to be done this young generation's way. That's where I think Gillam's genius was. I mean, it was great that he had the money, and maybe if he hadn't, yeah.
And that's ultimately,
and let's be fair and realistic.
Right.
There
If
were
you're
also,
a bad candidate,
there were
digital
also
advertising, yeah.
There were also three other candidates who were heavyweights who split the vote. Two really rich guys who blanketed the airs, and a really good, more conservative Democratic woman, Gwen Graham, and they all split the vote, and Gillam came in. So, you know, I'm not in favor of creating heroes, but Gillam was more like Stacey Abrams in the sense that he mobilized the core base and didn't worry about trying to be something he wasn't, because he wasn't beholden to all the consultants.
do you have to? I mean, you really have to. That's the problem. The problem with the Democrats is that you're going to have this problem no matter what, because Republicans, like literally, like step march together. If you've ever, I used to work for the Washington Post, and when I was a very young reporter, I had to cover parties. I know it sounds dumb, but a lot of stuff goes on at parties in Washington. A lot of politics goes on at parties. And one of the most astonishing things was every single Republican Party was flawless. Like the food was good, the drinks were good, the ballet was good, every single thing about it. And they all behaved. They just did. They all like there's all these ladies in sheaths would show up and they would do this. And it was really fascinating from a visual point of view. You'd go to a Democratic event, and God help you if you could get like a piece of cheese. I know it sounds dumb, but it was like crazy. And it was like demented and like badly, and everyone was warring with each other. I don't know if you can avoid that because you have a group that is really more of America, that has lots of differences. And so we're not going to go low. You know, I know Michelle Obama said when they go low, we should have gone low a lot more. That's my feeling. But our inclination is to feel bad when we go low, kind of stuff. So you're going to get that. You're going to get, you know, if we did the whole fear and loathing thing that Trump does, we would do a lot better. We just can't.
Well, the problem is if we do the fear and loathing thing, we end up with the kind of country that Donald Trump would be happy with. And we're not about that. Right. I mean, I said this before. We represent the side of human beings that believes in a future and believes in hope. The Republicans are terrified of the future. They're terrified of demographic change. They're terrified of diversity. The one thing you didn't say is, I bet all those folks were old and white.
Yes.
I went down.
No, they were all white, but that's
I mean, I went to the floor of the Democratic Convention. Look at the floor next time I mean, it's just unbelievable. It does look like America, a little older, and this time it won't be. I was, you know, with the opposite party goes on the floor of the other convention because for news interviews, yeah, the podium, they throw the 4 black people and all that up on the podium. They're so old and so white on that floor. They don't look anything like the United States of America looks today. And yet they hope that someday that's what America will look like again. Well, who the hell wants to play their game if that is what you end up with for America? None of us are interested in that. And even if we were, it wouldn't happen. This is an unrealistic group of people who are clinging to something that never existed, that they wish did. It's not going to. And the only way that they get what they want is if we play their game. So messy we are, disagree we are, we'll debate the issues. Sometimes we'll make big mistakes. We're not as well organized, but this is the future of humanity, and we might as well embrace it and do the best we can to get there.
Absolutely. And also at the Republican convention this year, there's no Omarosa, right? So they lost 1 of 4.
There were more transgendered people on the floor of the Democratic National Committee than there were African Americans on the floor of the Republican Committee. How do you like that for a stat?
Except there were more men named, I think,
David
in the management staff of Facebook than there are women, but that's another issue. We got that problem here.
All right.
Yeah.
Just to underscore what Kara was saying, there's the saying that has stuck in my mind the most since I've been involved in politics, which is 17 months, is Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line. And there's like literally nothing I've heard that's more true.
Well, there's a hope there too. That is true, and I'm shocked. But when Alexandria won and beat Joe Crowley, and when Alana Presley beat Capuano, who is a very good guy with a voting record everybody in this room would be happy with, both of the people who were displaced immediately said they were supporting the other person. And that happened in another race where the progressive lost, and they immediately said, so I haven't seen that before. Usually it's, you carry a grudge and you eventually get over it. I think there's such a hunger in this country to rebuild of the vision that we lost, that I actually am hopeful, at least for the next 4 years, we're going to get through that willingness to burn the house down if we don't get 100% of what we want. I mean, just, 80% of the people who voted for Bernie in the primaries voted for Hillary. I mean, we're not talking, it's good copy to write about the conflict and the clickbait and all that crap, but truth is most people do want to win, and they're willing to settle for somebody they didn't vote for in the first place.
Okay.
And I think that's happening more because the stakes, I think people know how high the stakes are.
Right. Well,
just for the record, since this is a group of really smart people, I did not lose because of the screen. No, I didn't. We were in trouble. I knew I could feel the whole thing slipping away. We were not well organized. We weren't doing, we hadn't called the so-called ones on the list for a long time. And I was not a well-organized candidate. I was incredibly impassioned and inspirational, but I was not well-organized, and I was not disciplined. And I said a whole lot of things that would have been better if I hadn't said as you get closer to the election. The reason I lost was because I came in third in Iowa, and I was leading the polls 3 weeks before. It was exactly what happened to Hillary in 2008. So in the screen was a lot of fun and blah, 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 but it really wasn't why I didn't win the nomination. I didn't win the nomination. I knew I wasn't going to win the nomination about 3 weeks before Iowa because I could feel the whole thing. It was really interesting. You'll get this because this is where the Grateful Dead originated. So I'd give these rallies, and people would come, and there would be, the place would be full, and all the other candidates would be pissed because they were getting, 50, 100 people, and I was getting 1,000, 800. And then I realized that I'd do an event, and then I'd go to a small house party, and then I'd go do another event, and it was the same people. They were following me around like the Grateful Dead. They'd see me 3 or 4 times a day all over Iowa, and the next day they'd do it again. And I went, oh shit.
Yeah.
And the other problem was they weren't Iowans. They were from all over the country.
Oh no.
That's why I lost.
That's also a little, yeah.
Okay, we had 6 people. Can we get 12 people here to raise their hand?
So we need somebody from Microsoft, and then we need somebody from Twitter, and we're going to have somebody from Facebook, and what about Yahoo? Yahoo!
That was good.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
to Kara and Howard.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.